Okay, welcome back. This is Richard Golson. We're going to take a look at task 3.2, the second half of that. Um, in the first half, we created a launch template for our auto scale group. In this half, we're going to create the auto scale group itself and connect it to the load balancer and target group. So that way, when those EC2 instances launch, having been associated with the load balancer, they'll be able to receive the traffic from the load balancer. Okay, so let's go ahead and have a look at that. We're going to scroll down here and we're going to create our auto scale group. Here we can see the launch template that we did create earlier. Just as a reminder, when we created that, we identified the AMI, the instance type, the security group that's associated with those instances, the vote key. There are other things that we did not configure with that, including availability zone and subnets. So we skipped that because we're going to define those in the moment when we do the auto scale group. The other piece I just wanted to point out is if we needed to make a change, we don't change the template itself. What we do is we create a new version of the template and then we assign that version as the default version. So we only have this one version, but if I had to change it, I would create another version, be a version 2, and then make that the default. And that way it can always roll back to the previous version. All right, enough said on that. Now, what's great is I can go ahead and launch my auto scale group from here by going actions, and you'll notice that we can launch an instance from here. We can modify the template, all kinds of stuff. And then there's a create auto scaling group. Now, I'm going to go over here to auto scaling because I'd like you to be able to see the splash page. So if I go over here, we can see that it gives us a reminder that when we create an auto scale group, we're going to be defining a min, a desired and a max and assigning where it can scale, and then it will scale out as needed. And in that process, we're going to also have the ability, depending upon the need, of setting it up to respond to changes in traffic. I don't believe we do that in this lab, but we're going to define a fixed size and then we'll play around with it a little bit. Okay, so be that as it may, let me go back over to my launch templates, which are at the top, and then we'll use the link from there. Okay. And that makes it a little easier because when I create my autoscale group from here, it'll already be associated with my launch template. And as you can see, it's already associated here. Now, the autoscale group, we'll just go ahead and name that inventory ASG. And we're good to go down here, nothing to change, and we'll hit the next. All right. So this is where we're going to ensure that it launches into our lab VPC. That's the great thing about the template. It's not constraining us. We can use that template with wherever we want, right? Anywhere in our account within this region. The availability zone. So if we go back and think about where we're deploying this, right? It's going to be in the private subnets. If we take a look at the diagram we saw earlier, we're deploying here. Now, if you recall, when traffic is sent, it's going to be, we're going to, we created an application load balancer, and that actually has a DNS address. And let's take a look at that. Okay. Here's our load balancer details. And if you take a look here, there's this DNS name. So we're going to use that as the recipient of the traffic, right? So typically with DNS, what you do is you configure this, you'd associate this with the name of your website. www.myleftshoe.com would be associated with this DNS name, which then would be associated with an IP address. We don't have to worry about the IP address part, but this is what we would use in the A record for our site, or the appropriate DNS record, not the A record. So all that would be taken care of. we don't need to worry about that right now. Point being that traffic is going to be sent to this address. And then what happens is the traffic will then, once it goes to the load balancer, the load balancer will forward it to the listeners, and the listeners will forward it to the application servers in the autoscale group. So we can place that autoscale group in private subnets, and it'll be just fine. Right? We don't have to worry about it, and we're not going to assign an IP address to them, a public IP address. They're just going to have private IP addresses. So that being said, let's go choose that. So we want private subnet 1 and 2, and there they are, no particular order. There we go. So there's our private subnet 2 and a private subnet 1. All right. Now, in terms of distribution of instances that get launched, it's going to do its best effort to balance so that it has equal numbers of instances in each availability zone, right? So the whole goal here is to try to spread that out. If an availability zone becomes unhealthy, it would launch any additional instances it needs to launch to make up for the instances in the failed availability zone. It would launch them only in the healthy availability zone. That's the cool thing. It's not going to launch an instance in availability zone that would be useless because it's unhealthy. Okay, let's hit the next button. And we have a load balancer. So we're going to attach to an existing load balancer. Notice that you can create a load balancer at the time you do this. We're not going to do that. We'll attach it to an existing load balancer. And then note, when you do that, you actually have to point to the target group. So we don't select the load balancer, we select the target group. So it's really important when you create your target group and your load balancer that you use names that make sense so that way you're not all confused about what you're trying to choose here, right? So that'll associate those, all right? And then we have some additional health checks. Let's see if they want us to do anything with the health checks. Okay. So we do want the elastic load balancing health checks, okay? And we have a health check grace period of 90 seconds. So turn that on, turn on elastic health load balancing health checks. So the elastic load balancer will monitor whether the instances are available to handle the requests. So when it reports an unhealthy instance, the EC2 autoscaling can then replace it on its next periodic check. So that EC2 instance or that EC2 autoscaling group will start to detect and act on those health checks performed by that load balancer. So there are settings you can configure that would first verify the health of the instances and stuff like that. So lots of additional options that you can play with. We're going to set this to 90 seconds. Okay. And then we'll need to enable the group metrics. Okay. Sometimes these settings are moved elsewhere. So we'll see if we can find that. Next. Haven't seen it yet, but let's go ahead and configure this. So we're going to opt for a desired capacity of 2, a minimum of 2, and a max of 2. So this will be steady state. The goal is to maintain a steady number of 2 instances. This is not uncommon because we're not going to set up a target tracking. So no scaling on this. This will allow us to ensure that we have a static or fixed number of instances. Now in the additional settings, oh, we still haven't done that one yet. We'll see if that comes up. There it is. Enable group metrics collection within CloudWatch. Okay. It captures metrics at 1-minute intervals, and scaling can then react more quickly than the standard 5-minute intervals. We'll hit next. This is really cool because you could actually have it send you a notification so that if, in this case, we wouldn't expect a lot of auto scaling to occur, meaning that the only reason why auto scaling would create a new instance is if something in the environment failed, right? So this would actually give us a heads up that, hey, there's an issue with our application environment, and then we can go take a look at it while at the same time it is doing its best to deploy a new instance to ensure that the application remains available. So this gives us that additional capability. All right, we took care of that. No scaling policies. We're going to have the instances tagged as they're created. So each instance will get a tag. So we'll add a tag. It's be a name tag, but we can also do other kinds of asset tags. So we could have it tagged for projects, um, cost centers, things like that. And that should do it. So at this point, we would just review. We can see that this is our auto scaling group. It's using our launch template. It's using this VPC. Here's our subnets. These are the two private subnets. And then we can see that it's been associated with a load balancer and a target group. Happily, we named them practically the same thing, so it's very easy to tell that they're related to each other. And then we can see that we set our size at 2 across the board. No notifications. And if we take a look down here, each instance will be tagged inventory app. That'll be its name. I'll go ahead and click create auto scale group. Okay. And now it's updating capacity. Let's go ahead and click on its name. And what we should see ultimately that in instance management, there they are. So they're pending. So 2 instances have been launched. If I go to my activity, you can see down here that neither one is in service, meaning that even though they've been launched, they're not available for traffic. Now, it might actually beat me to this, but let's go ahead and try the load balancer and get the name, the DNS name, and we'll go ahead and paste that in. And you can see that we're not getting a response back yet, as one would expect, because Autoscale is still working on deploying the instances. What's great is in the activity page, which is where we're at. So if we take a look here, you can see we're in the activity page. You can hit the refresh. Okay, so now it's been launched successfully, right? If I read the details, user request created an auto scaling group. So that's what created the new instances. It was by creating an auto scale group, which if there was something else that triggered the creation, perhaps a failed instance, we'd have a different message here, right? And the goal is to ensure that we meet the desired capacity, because the desired capacity was at 0. That's the starting state. But we configured the desired capacity is 2. So if we take a look up here, you can see the desired capacity says 2 here. Okay. This ultimately might get updated with some additional information. So if I hit the refresh here, okay, no status information yet. And if I come down here, you can see no differences here. If I take a look across here, instance management, you can see the 2 instances, both named inventory LT, both are marked as healthy. And then if I take a look over here, I'm getting a 504 gateway timeout, basically because the instances We're not available yet. We'll click on that and see if it's responsive yet. Now, let's take a look in here because there may be more configuration we need to do, all right? So we know at launch, we created the instances using a security group that was created for us, right? But we took a look at that early on. We also created our own security group for the application load balancer, which I'm comfortable with. If I take a look at that for the load balancer and I go take a look at its details, we can see in network mapping that we should actually be able to see that security, I believe, is where we want to take a look. There's our security group. And if I click on it, that looks good, right? We're allowing traffic there. So when we come back, we're going to go to task 4 and update our security groups because there's an issue with the security groups. Okay. So I'll see you at task 4.